Hey guys, welcome to Rebuilding the Beast. I'm your host, Festus Azili, NBA player turned podcast host. And on this show, I'm going to have a lot of my inspiring friends come on to share with you their rebuilding journeys. I hope you can take the tips from their lives and apply it to your life as well. Oh, and don't forget to hit subscribe, like, comment, share with a friend. All the things. All right, I'll see you guys soon.
Deputy Drenka, welcome to Rebuilding the Beast. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's Friday, looking forward to the weekend and relaxing, so can't complain.
Oh yeah, no, I can't complain either. You can tell from I get really excited about Fridays. I'm just ready to go kick it. Hard work week, but not before we get to hear your amazing story. On this podcast, I've got to hear so many dope stories. This is the first time we're going to be talking about adoptions, and you're an adoptee from Korea.
Yes.
All right, let's dive into it a little bit. You know, on your blog, you share your experiences as an adoptee. When did you first realize, or when were you first told that you were adopted?
Well, because I was a transracial adoptee, which means that I was adopted into a family of a different race. So my parents were white. My parents are white when they adopted me. And so growing up, I just always knew that I was adopted. I don't remember a moment specifically when my parents told me, but it was very obvious that I didn't look like them. And so it was something that they really needed to instill in me from the beginning. And the story that I was told was, I was born in Korea and I was 3 months old when, I came from Korea to Chicago O'Hare. And the beginning of my life story essentially began at the airport. All of the photos that I had from my childhood began with my parents picking me up at Chicago O'Hare, all my family sort of surrounding me and welcoming me into the family. And then I was just here, and I was lucky to be placed with this family and given a chance at a better life. As I grew older, my parents were always very open if I had questions. I actually didn't have that many questions when I was younger. They were really forthcoming about all the information they had from my adoption agency, which could be condensed into one paragraph. So they had my name when I was born in Korea. I was named Kyung-sun Shin. Shin was the family name, and Kyung-sun was like my first and middle name. They knew my birth parents' names and where I was born. And the story that was in the paragraph, my history of admission, said that my birth parents were married, but then my birth father caused a traffic accident and he was a taxi driver, so he couldn't work. And because of their the differences in their relationship and the scanty livelihood is how they put it, they decided to give me up for adoption. So the adoption agencies sort of tell a similar story to all Korean adoptees, like your birth parents or your birth mother couldn't afford to keep you. They wanted you to have a better life. Many times the mothers are portrayed as single mothers, and the assumption is that they may remarry eventually and not tell their new family about you. And so it always made it seem like if I were to search for them, I would be somehow disrupting their life and potentially, making things worse for my birth mother. So I grew up just without sort of any questions about my origin. I just tried to belong and, in the place that I landed, which ended up being Marietta, Georgia until I was 10 years old, and then Southlake, Texas until I graduated high school. Both of those places were predominantly white suburbs, middle to upper class. Southlake, Texas especially is known for sort of the wealth and privilege. It's been in the national news in the last few months because of the overt racism that has happened and the fight between the people that are trying to make change and help the students and teach them about diversity and inclusion and equity, and then the parents who are very against that. So that was the world that I was in. I never felt like I belonged anywhere, and really my the saving grace for me was the arts. I was in choir and show choir and theater. So I had this sort of world that I could escape to. I've always loved stories. My mom was a librarian. And so I had sort of this very large imagination. And it was sort of a place that I could go to and forget how different I was and how I didn't belong. And it wasn't until I went to college, I decided I wanted something more diverse than Southlake, Texas. And I couldn't really articulate what I needed. I just knew I needed something different than what I experienced in high school. So I picked DePaul University because my family was from Chicago originally. I saw in a list of, how they rank colleges, DePaul was ranked the most diverse student body at the time. And so it felt like a place that I could go and maybe not stick out so much. So I enrolled there, and I went there with really good intentions. I was going to sign up, for the Asian American student organizations and sort of, get out of my comfort zone. So I went to a Korean student organization meeting, one of the first, few weeks I was on campus. And I was so overwhelmed being in a room with people who looked like me that I actually didn't know how to handle it. I had this I had a lot of internalized racism that I was dealing with. So I had sort of an adverse reaction to it. And I didn't go back for that first quarter. And I would see some of the Korean students from the organization walking down the street, and they would wave to me. I would pretend I didn't see them and cross the street because I was afraid to be associated with them. I was afraid of all of the racism I had seen in Texas. And I was afraid that if I got lumped in with this group of Asians in college, I would lose sort of my identity and my uniqueness.
Yeah, actually, I want you to tell me more about that. Tell me about, we've talked about belonging a little bit. And, it's funny. I have one of my best friends, or my best friend. He is originally from Cameroon, grew up speaking French, and was adopted by a white family in Texas. And he has an amazing story of how he came here, not being able to speak English, but even when he landed at the airport, he didn't know where to go. How do I get out of the airport to go to wherever I'm going? And so his story was, I just followed the white people. He was like, I just followed the white people. And eventually I found my exit with people holding a sign that said my last name. And then he grew up in a household in an environment where everybody was white. What was that like for you? You talk about, seeing some racism and it causing you to have this adverse reaction when you got to college. So tell me more about that and your experiences while you were growing up in Georgia and then Texas.
So my experiences were sort of twofold, because I had inside my family and in sort of the safety and comfort of my house. And the adoption agencies really coached parents around that time to not treat us as different. My parents had a biological son shortly after I was adopted. So my brother was their biological child. And so they wanted to treat us both equally. So my mom would always say things like, oh, we don't see you as adopted or different or Korean. We just see you as ours. We love you the same. And so there's this idea of sameness and colorblindness, and my racial identity was essentially erased. But then I would go outside into the world, and I would have students, make this, gesture with their eyes. They would tell me to go back to China, say that, at least we're American. I was called a chink in class. And, I would, whenever I sort of approached those conversations with my parents, I was very careful not to let on that I was hurt by them, because adoptees are expected to be grateful for their circumstances. It's part of the narrative. You were given a second chance at a better life, and, you're really lucky, you're blessed. And so whenever I would talk to them, I would maybe say it in passing, but the response would be well, we just don't know how anyone could be mean to you. You're our amazing, beautiful daughter. And it wasn't, it didn't quite register to them how prevalent the racism was in those spaces. So
okay,
I grew up.
Jump over that part, because that's important for people out there who are trying to speak. And for parents who adopted kids, some might not be able to express everything in their heart because of that feeling of like, I have to act like I'm grateful. That's got to be hard for your support system.
So it's hard for any adoptee that experiences any sort of discomfort around their adoption or around their identity and their experience, because we don't have the racial mirrors in our family and our community. We also don't have an outlet. And sometimes our parents are not given enough information about what adoptees need to be on the lookout for some of these signs. So I internalized a lot of the racism because I didn't have an outlet for it. I didn't have anyone that understood what I was going through. I just sat with it and I didn't know what to do with it. So one thing about adoptees is there's been research that has shown that adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-adopted people. So that's something I never had like suicide ideation, but I had some mental health and depression issues, and I would just keep it inside. And I actually turned to self-mutilation because I had all of this I knew that I was hurt and I knew there was something missing. I couldn't express it. I didn't exactly know what it was that was causing that pain. And so cutting myself was sort of a way to release it almost and put it out into the world and get it out of my heart and out of my body. One thing with adoptees, especially those whose parents have suffered infertility before. So my mom had 4 miscarriages before me. So one thing that I had always thought about was having to live up to what they had wanted for those, pregnancies that didn't come to pass, and make up for their losses and earn my place in the family. And so I really excelled in a lot of the things that I did because I put so much pressure on myself to earn my place and earn my parents' sort of love, which they didn't put that on me. It was just, again, the internalized narrative that I had growing up.
Where is all this narrative coming from? Who's telling you about what an adopted kid is supposed to look like, or where's this coming from? Where's the narrative coming from?
It comes from a lot of different places, but some of the most damaging has just been from strangers hearing my story for the first time. The first thing people say, where are you from? Where are you really from? Where are your parents from? So eventually it comes out that I was adopted. It was something that I didn't really present as forthcomingly as I do now. And so then the next reaction would be like, you must feel so lucky. And then it's, have you looked for your real parents? But it's always this reaction of like, you were saved and like you owe, fortune or God or your parents some sort of debt for being adopted.
It's kind of funny because, not funny, but the way I think about it is, there's a certain loss though. Like you, honestly, and I've never really said this before, I'm actually adopted. And there's a certain feeling of loss of your family, loss of, I don't know, like your culture in this case. How do you then reconcile both of those then?
Mm-hmm. So the loss, it was something that I didn't even realize I had, but I had it all along, and it manifested in different ways. It wasn't until adulthood and I started meeting other adoptees or hearing their stories or reading the research that has been done that I realized there is a trauma that happens when you're separated from your birth mother. Like I always thought, and that was part of my story. I was only 3 months old when I came to the US. I only spent a couple days in the adoption agency before I went to a foster mother. So I had this sort of mentality that, I was like one of the lucky ones. I was so young. There wasn't any damage done. I really got like a fresh start. And then I went to Korea for the first time as I had just finished college. I was invited to go there from the Korean government for a leadership conference. And it was by myself, but I had some friends that I went with, and the conference was really planned out. So we had a tight schedule, but there was one day that I decided to take the afternoon off and visit my adoption agency. And it was, it was just something that I was like, I'm in Korea, I might as well go see, where my story started, essentially, as I thought. And part of the visit was a tour of the baby's room, where the babies were waiting to be placed for adoption, waiting to be put into foster care, newborns, essentially. And I went into the room and I spent about 5 to 10 minutes, and it was probably 20 to 30 infants in their cribs in this room crying, at the top of their lungs. And there were 2 volunteers in there to hold the babies. And I couldn't go in because I didn't have my vaccination record. So I just stood outside the window and watched them cry. And the social worker who was with me said something. She was like, oh, that was you before, that was you. And it was just this idea that I had never imagined what my life was like before the airport, before that picture of my parents holding me. And I realized I was in that crib crying, not being held, not being comforted, even if it was I was only in there for 10 minutes, and it was brutal to watch them cry, knowing that there was nobody to hold them or tell them, they were loved and that they were safe. And so that's when I really understood the trauma that I experienced that I didn't even remember, but my body remembers it. And then there's the loss, like you said, of the culture. For me, it was a loss of my origin story. Young children, one of the first questions they ask is, where did I come from? And then there's this whole story about how mom and dad fell in love. And then you get the story of the grandparents, and you're rooted in history, and you have a sense of where you belong in the story of your family, in your community, in the world. And as an adoptee, I always felt like I was sort of floating, like I didn't belong quite. I didn't belong with Korea. I didn't belong in the US. I was just hovering in this limbo. And so when I went to Korea, heard more about my story, which again, it's a whole other thing. The agency kept a lot of information about me from my adoptive family. So I found out when I went to the agency that I had 2 biological older sisters that I didn't know about. And so that's when I decided to do my birth search.
Now, so a couple things happened. So you went back to Korea and you got to see yourself. Well, you kind of juxtaposed and put yourself in that position where you see the babies and you're like, wow, there was life before, and now you found out you have sisters. So take me through the search. You go looking for your birth parents and for your birth family. Take us on that journey with you.
Okay, so it started with the social worker. She opened the file, and for me, I was like, well, I've already seen my paperwork. This is just redundant. But she was like, I don't know how much information your adoptive family was given because of the laws at the time. And so babies at the time, you had to be abandoned or orphaned legally in order to be adopted outside the country. And so I thought I was, just sort of abandoned, single mother, whatnot. And so she told me, first of all, that my birth father had passed away in 2004. She had that information. And then she told me that I had 2 older sisters. That's all she told me. She didn't tell me names, ages. She just said, they might have been too young to know about you. So she asked if I wanted to start the search. I said yes. The process at the time was that if you start a search, they send a telegram to the last address that they had on file for your birth mother. And they send it with a message that says, someone born on this day is trying to contact you. And then they give the number to the agency because of privacy purposes, if it falls in the wrong hands. So they sent a telegram, did not receive an answer. Over the next couple years, they sent a few more. I actually went on a Korean TV show. There was a TV series called I Miss the Person, or I Want to See the Person. And they have, you tell your story and you give information, and then if anyone in the audience watching knows the person they call, and like they show all these reunions and stuff like that. Mine did not end in a reunion. There was no leads from the show. You know, I sort of gave up hope until 2013. I was engaged to my now ex-husband and planning the wedding. And I had this huge just feeling that this is something that I should share with my birth family. They should know that I'm getting married. They should have the chance to see me, to like share in this event, or just know that I was happy. So all these feelings came up while I was planning this. And I reached out to the agency one more time, told them I was getting married. Can you please send another telegram? The social worker actually sent someone to the address and came back and said that it looked like no one had lived there for several years. And so she was like, if you want to send a letter, we'll keep it on file and hope that, you know, they're looking for you. And that was the end. And so I had to grieve and mourn, but I knew, you know, I did everything that I could. And then a couple months later, it was Labor Day. On Labor Day, I got an email from the social worker saying, good news, I've successfully located your birth mother and your sisters. They're excited to meet you. She sent like a zip folder of their photos and told me that she was translating letters from them and she would send them to me. And like my mind was just blown. I was looking at these photos, trying to figure out who everyone was. Like I saw like a young man that I was like, maybe it's one of their husbands. And then I saw an older woman that must have been my birth grandmother, some kids. And I was just trying to place myself in this family and understand like where I fit in. And then I ended up flying to Korea to meet them. And I spent a week with them.
Oh my gosh, that must have been so crazy to meet your birth family and your mom, sisters. Oh my gosh, tell me about this.
So, I mean, the leading up to the trip was crazy because, you know, the letters that they sent me were in Korean. So then the agency had to translate it for me and I was waiting for that. And then in the letters, they told me a little bit more of the story. My birth mother sent me a gut-wrenching letter about how sorry she was. She carries so much guilt. It was my birth father that convinced her to give me up for adoption. He didn't want another daughter. They already had 2 daughters. But then I found out that they got back together, had a son. So the young man in the picture was my younger brother, full blood. And they were all sharing sort of this information about their families. Both of my sisters are nurses and married with kids. But one thing that really was, and it's been a really important part of my story, is that my birth mother said that even when she was holding me that first day, I looked so much like my middle sister, Kyung-hee, and she wanted to hold me until she died. And so then my sister told me that they didn't find out about me and my adoption until after my birth father passed away. He wouldn't let my birth mother tell the other siblings about me. And so as soon as he died, my birth mother told them the truth. My sisters and my birth mother started looking for me, but because he had arranged all of the paperwork, they didn't have any information. And it's really hard, I think, once the baby has been sent out of the country to like connect and find that information. And they didn't even know which adoption agency they had gone through. So my sister told me that she, ever since they started looking for me and my birth mother told them about me, she started looking for people who looked like her, because my birth mother told her that the baby looked so much like her. And it was so strange to me because I was like, how do, like, babies all look the same to me, honestly. But then I saw the pictures of my sister, and it was like the most surreal thing. It was like looking at pictures of myself, but like photoshopped in different locations or in different outfits. It was like my face had been superimposed in a different photo. And then so meeting her, I mean, meeting my entire family was so powerful. But for so long, I had gone without seeing anyone who looked like me. I never knew like whose like eyes I got, whose face, you know, like who I took after. And now I have someone that is almost an identical twin to me. And like, I feel for the first time that I am like physically, like inextricably connected to someone on this planet.
You've been able to build a relationship with your sister. Are you guys in touch still?
So it was very awkward at first because we only had an interpreter, the social worker, with us for the first day and a half of my trip. So I flew to Korea and we all met at the adoption agency. It was my birth mother, my two older sisters, and then we ended up meeting my brother and my grandmother later. And so we were sitting, you know, in the adoption agency with the interpreter, kind of going through a lot of the backstory that they had alluded to in the letter, just getting more information about their family history, my birth father. It was pretty surface level at the time. My middle sister, Kyung-hee, spoke a little bit of English. She had some friends that taught her English, at least like basic phrases. And English, I think for Korea is sort of like Spanish in Texas. You like everyone takes English classes at least to a certain point in their education. And so she was, you know, we could, between Google Translate and, you know, the few Korean phrases I knew and the English she knew, we were able to communicate. And my oldest sister had to work. She had a different work schedule. And so I spent less time with her. My birth mother, it was really difficult. She didn't speak English. And also she had so much shame from the adoption and the relinquishment that she really had trouble communicating with me. She wouldn't even make eye contact with me. She kept just like looking down and like shaking her head. And when she would say something, it would be like, I'm sorry. She just kept saying, mianhe, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And so it was really difficult she wasn't, I think, ready. She had her own healing process that she needed to do. So I really ended up bonding most with my middle sister. We spent the most time together. We could communicate. And then we had this really special bond of looking like each other and like having that surreal sort of connection. And so her and we spent the week together, and it was really clear how similar we were, not just in how we looked, but in our interests, like our even like our fashion sense. It was so moving because I could see us, like if we had grown up together, we would be those best friends, sisters, like inseparable. You know, we probably would, you know, live, you know, in the same community and raise our kids together. I got a glimpse of the life that I would have had if I hadn't been adopted. And she was a really strong part of that. I would have had a sister. I grew up, I mean, I love my brother, but I think for girls, like we always just wanted, you know, a sister we could play dress up with and like share clothes with. You know, it was just something that I had always missed and wanted. And I had it and I didn't know. So her and I stayed in touch through an online messaging platform that they use in Korea. She actually came to visit me a couple years later with her husband and her daughter and stayed with me for about 10 days. And then I went back to Korea in October 2019, right before COVID, and was able to spend more time with her and the rest of my birth family.
How did your, by the way, now, do you speak Korean? How does that work when you go over there?
Yeah, my Korean is very limited. I can order Korean barbecue in restaurants and I can like have conversations. So really, I'm sadly relying a lot. It's a lot of labor on my sister's part. She knows more English than I know Korean.
Google Translate too, because you could just talk.
We do. And sometimes we'll type something and just show each other like what we were trying to say. But a lot of it's just really short sentences. But it's really hard to describe too. But my sister and I have like a sort of a weird like psychic connection too. And so like we'll communicate like really haphazardly in our different languages. but she knows what I'm saying. And like, we feel it when we're together. There was a really emotional moment for me when it was one of my last days on this most recent trip. And she was telling me a little bit more about her story, which, I mean, it's her story. She has her own story of after I was born and given up for adoption, my birth mother and my birth father split up. My birth mother was so upset and distraught over having to give up her baby that they separated. But she took my oldest sister with her, and then my birth father took my middle sister with him. So they were separated for several years. So my sister had her own story of trauma and being separated from her family and feeling alone and being abused. And so we were talking, and she was just saying, you know, how difficult it was for her growing up. And I told her, I don't even know what we were talking about. I just said, you know, my brother and I close, and then I just sort of trailed off, and we both just started bawling and like hugging each other, because we just both realized what was taken from us and what we missed out on. And that this whole time we thought we were alone in our pain, and we had each other. My ex-husband was with me, and he was watching us, and he ended up starting to cry just because he got so overwhelmed seeing us interact.
It does sound very, very emotionally, like just a powerful moment for you to be able to family again. What about your parents, your American parents? How did they support, or how did they view this trip, and the way you also looked at them?
The search was hard for them when I told them that I was going to start looking for my birth family. And I did it very impulsively. You know, I had just been to Korea. I found out all this information. It was sort of just like an emotionally traumatic time for me. And I was in sort of fight or flight mode. So I came back from that trip. I had just graduated college, and I told my parents, I'm going to move back to Korea and teach English and learn the language and look for my birth family. And my parents were like, oh my gosh, this is like too much for us to handle right now. Like, calm down, take a beat. So I started making preparations to go back and teach English in Korea. And then my mother's father, my grandfather, was diagnosed with cancer. My mom's an only child. I knew sort of the support that she was going to need. I didn't want to be out of the country if or when something happened to my grandpa. So I decided to stay. So my mom was going through her own emotional journey with taking care of her dad at that time. And my search was adding to her emotional turmoil. And I realized that. And so I didn't really bring it up with them. They didn't really ask me how it was going. I showed them the video when I was on the TV show, but besides that. And so when I found them, I don't think they were prepared. I don't think they thought it was possible. I think they thought, we're just going to let Stephanie sort of, go through the process that she needs to for closure. But it seemed so unrealistic for me to find them. So they weren't prepared, I think, emotionally when I did find them. And it was hard for them. My mom didn't really understand why I needed to look. I think she felt slighted, or that it somehow reflected on our relationship, which was not the case. And my dad was sort of a mediator and helped her explain, like, well, if you found out that you had two sisters that you didn't know about, wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to see them? And then they were really as supportive as they could in the ways that they knew how to be. So my dad worked for American Airlines, and he arranged all of my travel to Korea, put me up in a nice hotel for the first night so that I could relax and recover from jet lag. He actually, he booked a standby flight just so that he could get through airport security and wait with me at the gate until I got on my plane to go to Korea. They were there to pick me up when I got back. They were also really, really supportive when my sister came to visit. And I think it helped my mom to see my relationship with her, that it didn't take away from my relationship with them. It was just sort of an added benefit. And it was nice because my mom was an only child. We have a relatively small family now. And so to have like a very full house during Christmas was happy memories for all of us. So it took some time for them to get used to the idea. And it's still a difficult thing for them to talk about. But they realize how fortunate and how, this is something that most adoptees don't ever have an opportunity to do and to understand and to connect with their birth family. So they realize how fortunate I am.
Talk to me about bonding, right? In one of your blog posts, you talked about experiencing trauma bonding with your ex-boyfriend. Can you explain what that is? And in a situation like this where, I wonder how this experience also affects you being able to connect with other people. And that
the abandonment wound, the abandonment issues have been present my whole life. And I didn't realize how closely they were tied to that original trauma of separation at birth. But it was always a feeling like some people were eventually going to leave. And that's the story we're told. We're told that your birth mother loved you so much that she gave you up, that she sent you away. So we have this narrative that love means that almost you're disposable and that nothing is permanent. And so I would find myself really in relationships being either super needy and like not wanting to be apart from my partner, or if I had any sense that they were going to leave, I got out of there. Yeah, I ran. My ex that I talked about trauma bonding, it was another adoptee that I met while I was in Korea that very first time. He was part of the conference with me. And so he was the one that I happened to talk to at lunch after I found this information about my birth family, after I'd visited my agency. And it was that feeling of like nobody else could understand what I'm going through but another Korean adoptee. And it was just a very unhealthy way to start a relationship because I was in such a vulnerable place. And he ended up having a lot of issues on his own. And it was just a really toxic relationship. But I felt like, because I was in that situation where I was like, nobody else knows what's happening. And I sort of started that relationship thinking I'm deficient in some way. Like, this is the only person that will ever understand me. And it put me in sort of a position where he was able to control a lot of the relationship because I was in such a fragile state.
Real quickly, I would love to know how you got through this trauma. How you got over it.
I think that I got over it by pushing it down to the point where I couldn't repress it anymore, and it just came out and I had to face it. And I don't think that's the most healthy way to deal with it. So I went through some unhealthy relationships, and then, my marriage, I got divorced last year. Sadly, it wasn't because, we didn't love each other. He was my best friend, but I think I married him because he was so safe, because I knew he would never leave me. He was so loyal, and we were such good friends that I felt comfortable. And I overlooked the fact that we weren't the best romantic partners, and that we didn't bring out necessarily the best in each other. We didn't push each other to, be our full selves. But because I had gone through so much trauma, like, the safety was really appealing to me, and I was comfortable and safe, but I wasn't being authentic to myself. And a lot of the healing has come since my last trip to Korea, being with my sister again, remembering that I have been loved. So one thing that my sister has told me is always remember you were born to be loved. And it was sort of like, I wasn't sure if she meant in the translation, like, you've been loved since birth, but I just kind of use that as a mantra now. Like, I was born to be loved. Nobody is born not deserving of love. I was never abandoned because I was unwanted. My birth mother wanted me so much that she has physical pain when she thinks about having to give me up at birth. I was so wanted. I was so loved, not just by them, but my adoptive family. And that healing process has come from getting access to my story. And that is what is so hard for adoptees. I have one of the luckiest stories ever. Like, I found my birth family. I got all the answers I needed. My birth family wanted to be in relationship with me. Some adoptees will never find their birth parents. Some adoptees found their birth mother, and the birth mother did not want contact with them. And so many adoptees are going through life without these roots, without this understanding of how and why their life, came to be. And that is why we are such a vulnerable population. Not to mention the fact that transracial adoptees are now facing, external racism, being in communities that don't understand them, that are probably perpetuating some of the racism. More than 35,000 adoptees are living without citizenship right now. And of course, during the Trump era, citizenship and deportation was a huge concern for all immigrants. And so there's so many layers of what adoptees face, compounded with the fact that when we do express anger, when we do express any sort of discontent, we get told from both sides, well, you're lucky that you weren't aborted. What else? You would be living in an orphanage if this didn't happen. Like, we don't have safe outlets to process all of the many, many things that we face.
I wonder, you as an adoptee, would you yourself adopt a child?
So I grew up saying that I would, because I was part of that fairy tale narrative. I was like, I'm going to, give back and, save a child. In my marriage, and, now I'm 35 or so, I've been exploring 35. So I've explored parenthood. I tried to have a child with my ex for several years unsuccessfully. And adoption is always the first thing that people say when they, you get to a certain age, and it's like, oh, are you guys going to have children? And then, if I share that we've had fertility struggles, it's, oh, you can always adopt. And first of all, I have a lot of issues because adoption is seen as like a second choice. And I grew up feeling like a consolation prize, and I never want to put that on another child. But now that I'm also more aware of some of the issues with adoption as a system and this sort of predatory institution, I do not want to perpetuate that either. So what I have thought about is fostering and legal guardianship, but without severing the child's ties to their birth family, with the intent that hopefully they are able to reunite with their birth family or their biological parent at some point in time. Or if not, guardianship without changing their name, without erasing their history, making sure they have access to, their birth certificate and all of the information that they are owed.
That's beautiful. I feel like I'm learning so much right now, actually. So, home stretch, but I wanted to get to this topic because I think it's really important. I want to talk about, you being very active about spreading awareness on anti-Asian hate crimes and the stereotypes and sexualization that Asian women face. What has your experience been about this from a young age?
I think that the reason I am so vocal in this space and at this time on the topic is because I was so young when I experienced this on many different occasions. It could be as simple as I was on a middle school field trip to like this like horse ranch or something, it's Texas. And one of the employees at the ranch came up to me and was like, oh, wow, you're Asian. And I was like, well, yeah. And he was like, oh, I used to fight in the Vietnamese War. Asian women are the most beautiful women in the world. I'm like a, 6th or 7th grader at the time, kind of sick to my stomach hearing this. And that was something that was sort of common, like older men sort of seeing me as a woman, even though I was, a preteen or a teen. I was also so isolated from sort of my peers. I didn't feel like I had a place at South Lake Carroll. Like theater was one thing, but Carroll is known for its football team. So theater people are like on the very bottom of the social hierarchy. And then I don't fit in even more. I gravitated to the internet. That was when AOL and Yahoo chat rooms were becoming a thing. I had a camera at the time. My grandpa had bought a digital camera off of Home Shopping Network and gave it to me. I started taking pictures of myself and chatting with people in Yahoo chat rooms. It was when I was 13, 14 years old. And I didn't know, nobody knew anything back then about online predators. And I had somebody that claimed to be a 28-year-old man who told me that I was beautiful after he saw my picture. Oh my gosh, you're Asian, you're so beautiful. I tied my beauty with Asianness because that's what the men associated with. Anyway, I was, talking to this person for several weeks, not knowing that I was being groomed by, somebody that was preying on like a young woman, 13, 14 years old. And I met him. He wanted to meet. And I met him on 4th of July in my town square. And the arrangement was my parents were going to be eating dinner with my friend's parents. And so her and I were going to be at Starbucks. And he would meet me at Starbucks. And he said, like, I'll be, in a green striped shirt and glasses. And I didn't have a picture of him because back then it was common for people to not have pictures of themselves. Digital cameras really weren't accessible back then. And so I saw him and I felt sick to my stomach. He was not 28 years old. He looked like he was probably 40. But then I had this internal struggle where I was like, well, this is someone that has told me that they love me and they, that I'm beautiful. Am I just being really shallow? Like, so I went out and I hugged him and I just felt so gross and so dirty. And I knew it was wrong. And I made an excuse and I was like, oh, my parents are coming back. I'm sorry. I can't, go with you. And I dodged a bullet. And for years, I think about that. And I blamed myself. I was like, you put yourself in that position. You were sending your photo to a complete stranger. Like, what did you expect? And now I see, like, I was targeted because I was Asian, because I was too young to know any better. And this was somebody that saw me as an object because of my ethnicity, because of my Asianness, and had fantasies that were being projected on me. And that was hate. That was racism in a very covert way. And people always, think about Asian fetish as like a compliment. And I just knew that it wasn't a positive thing. Like it made me prey. It made me weak. And after the Atlanta shooting, everyone sort of coming to the defense of the shooter and saying, like he was just trying to eliminate the temptation without seeing Asian women as people first. They were just this fantasy or this object of his desire that, he could eliminate. It just brought back all of those things from my childhood, all the things that I told myself, like, you were at fault. A lot of times I actually exploited my Asianness because that's what I felt like guys wanted. That was the only way that I would get a guy to like me, is if he had a thing for Asians. I played into that stereotype because I didn't have positive role models in the media telling me that there was a different way.
it hurts my heart to stop in this moment because I feel like there's so many more questions, but we have a hard stop here in a minute. But I'm so grateful for your sharing your story. We're going to have to do another episode where we talk about the ways that we can be allies and do better things for, just that for us to use our voices to speak against Asian hate. But where can we find your page, meanwhile, to get educated on these topics? Where can we find you, your message, voice?
So everything online for me is just my name, stephaniedrenka.com, and at Stephanie Drenka. I'm pretty active on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook, somewhat. Another resource, I founded a magazine for voices that have been marginalized or underrepresented historically. And so it's visiblemagazine.com. And I've tried to prioritize a lot of adoptee voices and other people that are writing about this on there as well.
You are incredible. Thank you so much. I dub you a beast for what you're doing with your voice, with your story. Thank you so much.
Hey, Festus here. I hope you liked that episode. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and here's some more episodes that you might like. On this side.